This has been a rather remarkable week, hasn't it? This time last week when we gathered for worship, we feared the worst. A long, drawn-out ground war with high cost to life on both sides of this conflict. And now, just a week later, we're on the other side of victory. Laying aside all of our concerns about whether or not we should have been over there in the first place, or whether or not there might have been other less destructive ways to resolve the issue, laying those concerns aside, we can stand in awe of the brilliant military endeavor that we have seen play out in the Persian Gulf over the past week. Within 100 hours after the ground war began, it was over, with very little loss of life on the side of the coalition forces. Some remarkable stories have come out of this past week. Stories that are poignant and touching about how Iraqi soldiers were eager to surrender to coalition forces. You perhaps heard most of the stories that I heard, but they bear repeating for our purpose this morning. One of them I recall, one of the earlier ones in the week, was from a woman radio journalist who had been on the front lines during the operations of the beginning of the ground war. And she and her crew were approached by a group of Iraqis who spied them out and sought them out in order to surrender to a news team. And they weren't the only news team that functioned as representatives of the coalition forces to whom Iraqi soldiers surrendered themselves. These people seemed desperate to get this war over with, to get out of the trenches and into the safety of the opposing army. Then you perhaps heard the story of the American soldier whose Jeep had been mired in the desert mud. It'd been raining over there last week, and things got bogged down a number of places. And this soldier was out by himself in his vehicle, and it had become bogged down, and I'm sure fear and panic grabbed his heart as he saw an Iraqi tank approach him. But lo and behold, the Iraqi tank crew got out and hooked up a chain or rope or something to his Jeep and pulled him out of the mud and then surrendered to him. As things like that have been happening all week. You've perhaps heard the story of the reconnaissance drone plane that had been sent out over the area of Kuwait to spy out the land and find out what was going on. Drone planes, of course, are pilotless, so they didn't know what the plane had seen until they brought it back and landed it and began to review the videotape. And to their amazement, the plane passed over a group of Iraqi soldiers who dashed out of their bunker when they saw the plane coming, waving white flags, trying to surrender to a pilotless jet. But perhaps my favorite story, and this is true, came again early in the week about an Iraqi-American soldier, a student actually, who was here in this country studying and returned home to Iraq to visit his grandmother. And while he was there, he was drafted into the Army, sent to the front lines. He was most unhappy about it, as you can imagine. Well, when the ground war broke out and the American troops approached his bunker, he cautiously, but as quickly as he could, dashed out of his bunker wearing Bermuda shorts and a T-shirt that had Chicago plastered across the front of it. He walked up to the American troops and in perfect English said, and I quote, "Where the hell have you guys been?" We have seen a picture of a desperate people, unhappy with the conditions under which they've had to live, hungry and thirsting and starving and fighting disease in the trenches of life created for them by Saddam Hussein. They were ready, willing, and eager to put that old life behind and take up a new life that promised something different. At that point, they'd have taken almost anything if it promised to be different. That's St. Paul's message to you and me this morning. You look at the chapter of Romans from which this passage came, and at first glance it seems rather difficult. Paul is not known for his simplistic thinking. He's very obtuse, very hard to understand in many places in his epistles. And few are more difficult to understand than these early chapters of the book of Romans. But basically what he's saying to us in those verses is that God has given us the law for a particular purpose. And the purpose of the law was to point out to us the full extent of our sinfulness, to show us how devastating it really is to human life, to get us to see a picture of what we've done to life through our alienation with God and our rebellion against His will. And so God gave us the law that we might understand how life could be, how life is intended to be. And when we see that picture, we are like those Iraqi soldiers in the trenches who have gotten fed up with life as they've known it and are eager, ready, and willing to give themselves over to the opposing force who they have come to see almost as a friendly force. That's what Paul was trying to say to us, that there comes that time in life when it is to our advantage to let go of the old and to take on the new. Gene Zazio. Gene, are you here this morning? Yes. I didn't get downstairs early enough to talk to Gene before this sermon, but Gene comes into the office all the weeks that she's in town and proofreads our bulletin for us. Many of you know that Gene is a retired English teacher from Mayfield High School, and I have to tell you that when I was in 8th grade, I had an English teacher who told our class one day that she had a former student who was a minister in town in Houston, and whenever she went to hear him preach, she was always embarrassed by his poor grammar and syntax. I never preach anywhere where there's an English teacher present that I don't remember that story. And every week when Gene comes in to proofread the bulletin, I remember that story. And I'm telling you this for two reasons. I want you to know that if you find any mistakes in the bulletin, it's Gene's fault, not ours. And secondly, I'm telling you this story because this past week when Gene read the title for my sermon this morning, with consummate tactfulness, she said to me, Don, is aborning a word? And I had to admit, gee, I really don't know. Maybe I made it up. I thought I knew what it meant, but she had piqued my curiosity, so I went over to our huge Webster's Unabridged Dictionary in the office, and I looked it up, and sure enough, it wasn't there. So she told me I better explain to you what that word means this morning. It's all right to invent a word if you explain what you mean by it. But you know, I didn't let it rest there. I looked in another dictionary later in the week, one that's a little later edition than the one we had in the office. And Gene, I've got good news for you. Aborning was in the American Heritage Dictionary. It means coming into being, getting underway. That's the picture St. Paul has painted for us. We live in lives that are broken by sin, alienated from God, cut off from one another, and by the grace of God through Jesus Christ in our lives, God is able to come in and begin to bury that old life at the same time that a new life is aborning, coming into being, getting underway. That's the pilgrimage that God invites us to share when we begin to follow Jesus Christ and become His disciples. Old life dying, new life aborning. I can think of a lot of different times in your experience and mine when we need that kind of transformation underway in our lives. I think back to when I was an adolescent, and you perhaps can think back that far too. And you remember all the changes in your body that were getting underway at that time in your life. And some of those changes you understood, and some of them you didn't understand. And you remember the transformation in your emotional life that came about at that point in your life. And it was a terrible and fearsome thing for many of us. You remember as you were going through college or career training, your eagerness to put that behind you and to move on into your full adult life. I remember so well being a senior in seminary, 24 years of age, realizing that at that tender young age, which seemed old to me at the time, I hadn't done anything else in my whole life but be a student. And I had serious doubts as to whether I was ever going to be able to make it out there in the real world. You perhaps have had times like that too, when you're on the verge of a major transition in life. It's time to put away that what you've known, and it's time to take on something new that may be frightening. You perhaps remember the first day you went to school as a kindergartner, and the fear that you may have had in your heart at leaving home that was safe and secure, and when you had mother's attention all day long, having to give all that up and go to a strange place and be mingled in with strange kids and come under the teaching of a strange teacher. But you went anyway, and you entered into a whole new realm of life. There are times like that when we're faced with new responsibilities, new opportunities, new ideas, and new directions. And sometimes we find those things threatening and we want to draw back from them. But we discover that transforming power of God that renews our lives and leads us on if we will surrender to that power within us and give up the old and take on the new life that is aborning. Do we really want to be raised to new life? That's the operative question for many of us. As dire as life is in the trenches sometimes, at least we know what it's like. Some of the film that we've seen of those Iraqi soldiers this past week showed them climbing out of the bunkers in fear and trembling. They wanted to surrender, but they weren't at all confident about the kind of treatment they would receive. And there was that instantaneous moment before they were able to make known the sincerity of their intention to surrender, when their lives were in jeopardy, because the opposing coalition forces had to size them up and determine whether or not they were surrendering or whether or not they ought to be blown away. And so they were frightful moments. And we know moments like that too, when we're having to give up the old and take on the new. But God invites us with courage and with confidence to step through that doorway of opportunity and to embrace the new life He offers to us in Jesus Christ. And some people run an exercise at the beginning of each day in order to renew their strength and renew their vitality and to renew their love of life. And some people begin each day in prayer and meditation for the same purposes. What physical activity does for some, spiritual and emotional and mental activity does for others. And some people put them all together and do both the physical and the mental and the spiritual because they're eager to greet the new day that life brings. And some people are eagerly looking for new challenges, delighted and grateful that they've been able to grow through the ways God has brought into their life. But then there are some who want to hang back, and they're timid and shy and afraid to test new waters. They're afraid it's going to be too hot or too cold or too threatening. They're not sure they'll know how to swim in a new body of water. And so they cling to the known and the familiar and the comfortable and sometimes to the easy just because it is easy. But God invites us to lay aside those old lives, to break out of the bonds that sin and alienation have fast bound us in, to break out of the safe and the known, and to flee toward that new life that He offers to us in Jesus Christ. Kenneth Houck, for most of his life, was a Lutheran minister, a pastor, an active pastor in the parish. But he reached a point in his ministry when he decided to do something about the frustration that every caring pastor feels. The frustration that comes after spending a number of years in the ministry and finally realizing that there are more needy people in any parish than any one single pastor is able to serve. And so he decided to do something about that. And he developed a program in his own church that trained laypersons to skillfully care for other persons in the congregation. And he assigned them one-on-one. The program has come to be known as the Stephen Ministry. And the Stephen ministers in his church would take on somebody who was chronically depressed or had just been told of a disease that never would clear up and go away. Or perhaps they were terminally ill. Or maybe they were just chronically alone and isolated and lonely. The Stephen minister took on such persons and stayed with them until they got through the crisis or found a better sense of connectedness when whatever circumstances they faced. Ken Houck now is doing Stephen ministry training full time. It has become one of the most widely respected and widely used programs for parish ministry in the country. All because he knew that it's more important to teach people how to fish, that they might fish for themselves, than to train them to be dependent on one fisherman whose limited skills and energy would never be enough to satisfy all the needs. Well, in his book, Christian Caregiving, A Way of Life, Kenneth Houck tells the story of a woman he calls Anne. He had been counseling with her for a number of years. She had had many things to work through. Now they were finally to the point where they were about to conclude their time together as counselor and counselee. And Kenneth became quite concerned for her when, in the midst of that process of concluding, some new crisis arose in her life. And he was fearful for her that 5 years of therapy would go down the drain, that this new crisis would so unseat her that she'd be thrown back to where she had been 5 years before when he first started seeing her. He was pleased and grateful when she found her way through that crisis still emotionally intact. Yes, she felt the sadness and the sorrow and the frustration of her circumstances, but they didn't undo her as they would have before, and she came through well connected and well together. So that in his last session with her, he said to her, "Anne, we've done our work pretty well, haven't we?" Anne smiled and said, "Well, you know, I think it was really God who did it. There were times when I felt so low, so despondent, so out of control that I didn't know what to do about it. And I have an idea that at those times you didn't know what to do with me either. I really believe that God was with me when neither you nor I knew what to do. God was the one providing the therapy during those times. I think we both have done a good job. You've been a good therapist to me, and I have worked very hard myself. I've taken a lot of risks and shared a lot of scary and personal things about myself. But we need to give credit where credit is due, and that is with God." What a wonderful and powerful profession of faith that was. Anne had come out of the grave of her tattered and broken life and had discovered her new life, which was coming into being, getting underway by the grace of God. Her old life was dying. Her new life was aborning. You and I can know that process of resurrection in our lives as well, if we will but realize all we have to do is surrender to what appears to us from the inside looking out an opposing force. But that force is a friendly force. That force is God Himself, who is eager to draw us into His caring arms the moment we decide to step out of the bunkers of our broken and sinful lives. Let us pray. Our gracious Heavenly Father, You have made known to us a gleeful sense of life in Jesus Christ, a life that is fulfilling and whole. Free us from whatever binds us and prevents us from living that life, and draw us into its fullness. In His name we ask it. Amen.